Gideon Flint walked into the marsh at dawn with nothing but a hunting knife. The water reached his knees, dark and still, reflecting a sky that seemed too quiet for what was about to happen. Behind him, 3 sets of tracks led to the water's edge, but only 2 led back out. His neighbors had called him reckless. The town sheriff had refused to help. Even his own wife had begged him to reconsider. But as Gideon waded deeper into the murky water, his grip tightened on the worn leather handle of his blade. Some problems couldn't wait for other people's courage to catch up. The morning had started like any other on the Flint ranch. Violet was hanging laundry on the line, humming a tune their daughter Clara Belle had been practicing on the old piano. The cattle were grazing peacefully in the north pasture, and the sun painted everything in that golden light that made a man grateful for the life he'd built with his own 2 hands. Then Wade Langston came riding hard across the field, his horse lathered with sweat and his face pale as winter frost. "Gideon!" he called out, sliding down from his saddle before the animal had fully stopped. "You need to see this. Right now." They rode to the edge of Flint's property, where the grassland gave way to the vast marsh that stretched for miles toward the river. What Gideon saw there made his blood run cold. His prize bull, Magnus, all 1,500 pounds of him, lay motionless at the water's edge. But it wasn't just that the animal was dead. It was the way he'd died. The massive creature had been dragged from the solid ground into the shallows. Deep grooves in the mud showed where something had pulled him. Something powerful enough to overpower a bull in his prime. And the wounds. Gideon had seen plenty of predator kills in his 20 years of ranching, but nothing like this. "I told you those things were getting bolder," Wade said, his voice barely above a whisper. "First it was just the smaller livestock going missing. Now this." Gideon knelt beside the carcass, studying the massive bite marks. He'd heard the stories from other ranchers upstream. Cattle vanishing in the night, strange sounds from the marsh, shadows moving in the water where no shadows should be. But Magnus had been different. Magnus had been too big, too strong, too valuable to lose. "The sheriff won't do anything," Wade continued. "Says it's a natural hazard of living near the water. Told me if I don't like it, I should move somewhere else. As if a man could just abandon everything he'd worked for. As if 20 years of sweat and sacrifice meant nothing. As if his family should be driven from their home by creatures that belonged in the deep swamp, not hunting in his pastures." But what Wade didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that this wasn't the first time Gideon had seen those particular bite marks. 3 nights ago, something had tried to drag Clara Belle's favorite pony into the water while she was riding near the creek. Only his quick thinking and quicker shooting had saved both horse and rider. The question that gnawed at him now was simple. What happened when he wasn't there to shoot? That evening, Gideon sat at his kitchen table, staring at the hunting knife he'd inherited from his father. The blade was sharp enough to shave with, but against what lurked in those waters, it seemed as useless as bringing a candle to fight the darkness. Violet moved around the kitchen, setting plates for supper, but her movements were tense, mechanical. "You're thinking about going after them, aren't you?" she said without looking at him. After 18 years of marriage, she could read his silences better than most people could read words. "Can't just let them keep taking what's ours," Gideon replied, running his thumb along the knife's edge. "Magnus was worth more than we make in 3 good months, and if they're getting bold enough to come onto dry land, then we move the cattle to the south pasture. We build higher fences. We do anything except what you're considering." Violet finally turned to face him, and her eyes held a fear he'd never seen before. "I won't let you throw your life away over some animals." But it wasn't just about the animals anymore, and they both knew it. Clara Belle came running into the kitchen at that moment, her face flushed from playing outside, completely unaware of how close she'd come to joining Magnus at the bottom of the marsh 3 nights ago. The sight of his daughter's carefree smile made Gideon's decision for him. After supper, when Clara Belle was in bed and Violet was tending to her mending, Gideon walked out to the barn. In the moonlight, he could see the dark line of the marsh stretching into the distance. Somewhere out there, those creatures were waiting. Tomorrow, they might get hungry enough to venture even farther onto his land. Wade Langston was sitting on the porch when Gideon reached his neighbor's house. The older man looked up from the whiskey glass in his hands, unsurprised by the late visit. "Figured you'd be by," Wade said. "You've got that look your daddy used to get when someone was fool enough to steal his cattle. Need to borrow your boat," Gideon said simply. "The flat-bottom one you use for checking your traps." Wade studied him for a long moment. "And if I say no, then I'll wade in on foot. Either way, I'm going into that marsh tomorrow." Those things killed Magnus like he was a yearling calf. What makes you think you'll fare any better? Gideon pulled out his hunting knife, letting the moonlight catch the steel. Because I'm not going to stand there and let them drag me down. I'm going hunting. Wade poured himself another measure of whiskey, then offered the bottle to Gideon. Your funeral. But if you're set on this fool's errand, at least do it right. Those creatures hunt from below. You'll never see them coming in deep water. Then I'll make them come to me. The two men sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the distant sounds from the marsh, splashes that could have been fish jumping, or something much larger moving through the water. Finally, Wade stood up and walked to the edge of his porch. Boat's yours, he said, but I want your word that if things go wrong out there, you'll come back. Don't matter if your pride's wounded or your plan falls apart. You come back to that little girl of yours. Gideon shook the man's hand. You have it. As he walked home through the darkness, Gideon could feel something watching him from the marsh. Not the lazy, patient watching of an alligator sunning itself on a log. This was different, intelligent, calculating, as if whatever lived in those waters had already marked him as their next target. But what chilled him most was the realization that the feeling had been growing stronger every night. They weren't just getting bolder, they were learning his routines, studying his family's movements. Tomorrow's hunt couldn't come soon enough. Gideon woke before dawn to find Violet already dressed and standing by the window, watching the first light creep across the marsh. She didn't turn when he sat up in bed, but her shoulders were rigid with the kind of tension that came from a sleepless night. I made you coffee, she said quietly, and biscuits. They're wrapped in cloth on the table. He pulled on his boots and walked to her side. In the growing light, the marsh looked deceptively peaceful, just acres of tall grass and dark water stretching toward the horizon. But Gideon knew better now. Somewhere in that maze of channels and hidden pools, something was waiting for him. I could ride to the next county, Violet said, still staring out the window. Get the federal marshal, someone with authority to bring men and proper guns. Take 3 days minimum, Gideon replied, buckling his belt. And that's if he believes the story. More likely he'll think we're just scared ranchers seeing shadows. In the kitchen, Clara Bell sat at the table, picking at her breakfast. She looked up when her father entered, and Gideon saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten, a knowledge that things were changing, that her safe little world was under threat. Papa, she said carefully, are you going to hunt the monsters in the water? Gideon knelt beside her chair, choosing his words carefully. I'm going to make sure they don't come onto our land anymore. That's all. But what if they hurt you like they hurt Magnus? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Gideon looked at his daughter's worried face, then at his wife's reflection in the window glass. 2 lives that depended on him making the right choices. 2 reasons why he couldn't let fear make those choices for him. They won't, he said simply. Because I'm smarter than a bull and I'm going to be ready for them. An hour later, Gideon stood at the edge of Wade's property, loading the borrowed boat with everything he'd need. Rope, in case he needed to secure something. A canvas tarp, to keep his knife dry. A small hatchet, as backup. And most importantly, a piece of raw beef from yesterday's slaughter. Fresh enough to attract attention. Large enough to make any predator confident. Wade appeared as Gideon was pushing the boat into the shallow water. Last chance to change your mind, the older man said. Could always try poison, or traps. Safer ways to handle this. Safer for me, maybe, but not safer for anyone else who comes near this water. Gideon stepped into the boat, feeling it settle under his weight. Those things are getting bolder. Next time, it might not be cattle they take. The boat moved silently through the calm water, guided by the long pole Wade had provided. Gideon had grown up near water, had learned to navigate the shallow channels and hidden sandbars as a boy. But this felt different. The marsh seemed too quiet, as if every creature that belonged here had fled somewhere safer. 20 minutes into his journey, Gideon found what he was looking for. A small island of solid ground, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by water deep enough to hide anything underneath. Cattails and marsh grass provided cover on 3 sides, but left one approach completely open. Perfect for an ambush, if you were the one waiting on the island. He tied the boat to a fallen log and stepped onto the muddy ground. The earth was soft under his boots, marked with tracks he didn't recognize. Long, deep impressions that suggested something heavy had been hauling itself across the mud. Recently, Gideon placed the chunk of raw beef at the water's edge, then retreated to the center of the island. He drew his hunting knife and settled down to wait, every sense alert for the first sign of movement in the dark water around him. What he didn't expect was the sound that came from behind him, a low splash, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large pulling itself onto land. Gideon spun around to face the sound, his knife raised and ready. What emerged from the water made his blood freeze in his veins. The crocodile was massive, at least 12 feet long, with scarred hide that spoke of decades surviving in these dangerous waters. Its eyes fixed on him with an intelligence that seemed almost human in its calculation. But this wasn't the desperate, thrashing attack he'd expected. The creature moved with deliberate patience, hauling its enormous body onto the island with slow, measured movements. It knew exactly what it was doing. This wasn't its first time hunting something that walked on two legs. Gideon forced himself to breathe slowly, remembering everything his father had taught him about dangerous animals. Don't run. They're faster in short bursts. Don't turn your back. They'll take it as weakness. And most importantly, don't let fear cloud your judgment. The crocodile stopped about 10 feet away, its massive tail still trailing in the water. For several heartbeats, predator and prey studied each other across the small patch of muddy ground. Then, without warning, the beast lunged forward with shocking speed. Gideon threw himself sideways, feeling the snap of powerful jaws missing him by inches. He rolled across the wet ground and came up running, but the island was too small for escape. The crocodile turned with surprising agility, cutting off his path to the boat. This time, Gideon didn't retreat. As the massive reptile charged again, he stepped forward to meet it, driving his knife down toward the softer skin behind its head. The blade struck hard, but the thick hide turned it aside like armor. The impact sent vibrations up his arm, and he barely managed to leap clear of the retaliating tail sweep. The crocodile hissed, a sound like steam escaping from a broken boiler, and blood began to seep from a shallow cut where his knife had scraped along its neck. Not a killing blow, but enough to make the beast more cautious. It circled him now, keeping its distance, reassessing this prey that fought back. Gideon's mind raced. The knife wasn't enough. The creature's hide was too thick, its skull too heavily armored. He needed a different approach, something that would use the beast's own size and power against it. The next charge came faster than the first two. Gideon waited until the last possible second, then dove to his right and grabbed the crocodile's front leg as it passed. The massive reptile's momentum carried them both toward the water's edge, exactly where Gideon wanted to be. As they hit the shallows, Gideon drove his knife upward, into the softer skin under the creature's arm. This time the blade sank deep. The crocodile thrashed violently, its tail whipping through the water and sending spray in every direction. But instead of letting go, Gideon held on, using his weight to keep the wounded animal from getting its footing. Blood clouded the water around them. The crocodile's struggles grew weaker, but not weak enough. Even wounded, it was still powerful enough to drag Gideon under if he made a mistake. He needed to end this quickly, before his strength gave out or before. A splash behind him made Gideon's blood turn to ice water. Then another, and another. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw them. 3 more crocodiles, drawn by the blood and the sounds of struggle. They moved through the water toward the island with grim purpose, their eyes breaking the surface like dark stones. The wounded crocodile beneath him seemed to sense the arrival of its companions. It stopped struggling and went perfectly still, as if waiting for something. In that moment of terrible clarity, Gideon realized the truth that Wade had tried to warn him about. He hadn't been hunting them at all. They had been hunting him. Gideon's mind raced as the 3 crocodiles closed in from different directions. The wounded beast beneath him had stopped struggling, but he could feel its muscles coiled like steel springs, ready to explode into action the moment he loosened his grip. 20 feet of open water separated him from his boat, and the approaching predators were cutting off even that slim chance of escape. But panic would kill him faster than their teeth. Gideon forced himself to think like the hunter he'd always been, not the prey he'd become. These creatures were smart, but they were still animals. They had patterns, instincts that could be used against them. The first of the approaching crocodiles reached the shallows near the island, its massive head breaking the surface just 10 feet away. Instead of attacking immediately, it waited, watching, calculating. That's when Gideon realized something crucial. They were pack hunters, but they still had a hierarchy. The wounded one beneath him wasn't just any crocodile, it was their leader. Using his knife, Gideon pressed the blade deeper into the wounded animal's side, making it thrash and bellow in pain. The sound echoed across the marsh like a distress call. Immediately, the other 3 crocodiles began moving faster, their protective instincts overriding their caution. That was exactly what Gideon had hoped for. As the first crocodile lunged toward them, Gideon released his grip on the wounded leader and rolled backward into deeper water. The attacking crocodile, focused entirely on reaching its companion, charged through the spot where Gideon had been standing. But instead of finding him, it collided with the injured animal, sending both beasts tumbling in a tangle of snapping jaws and thrashing tails. The confusion bought Gideon precious seconds. He dove underwater, swimming hard toward the cattails at the far end of the island. The murky water made it impossible to see, but he could feel the vibrations of the massive bodies fighting behind him. Crocodiles were territorial even with their own kind, and wounded animals made poor decisions. Gideon surfaced among the tall reeds, gasping for air and fighting to stay silent. Through the stems, he could see the chaos he'd created. 2 of the crocodiles were locked in combat with each other, their confusion and adrenaline making them attack anything that moved. The third was circling the disturbance, trying to understand what had happened to the easy prey that had simply vanished. But his advantage wouldn't last long. Soon they would calm down, separate, and begin hunting him systematically. He needed to reach his boat before that happened, but it meant crossing 30 feet of open water under the eyes of apex predators designed by millions of years of evolution to kill things exactly like him. Gideon studied the movement patterns of the remaining crocodiles, waiting for the right moment. When the circling predator turned away to investigate a splash on the far side of the island, he moved, not swimming. That would create too much disturbance, but wading as quickly and quietly as possible through the chest-deep water. 15 feet. 20. The boat was close enough to touch when he heard the splash behind him. One of the crocodiles had spotted his movement and was coming fast, cutting through the water like a living torpedo. Gideon lunged for the boat's edge, hauling himself up and over just as massive jaws snapped shut on the space where his legs had been. The crocodile's momentum carried it into the side of the boat, nearly capsizing the small craft. Gideon grabbed the pole and pushed hard against the beast's head, forcing it back into deeper water. For a moment, predator and prey stared at each other across the narrow gap between boat and water. Then the crocodile sank beneath the surface, disappearing into the dark depths with the patience of something that had learned to wait for exactly the right moment to strike. Gideon knew this wasn't over. They would follow him now, track him back to his land, to his family. Running would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Gideon pulled the boat toward shore with desperate urgency, checking over his shoulder every few seconds for signs of pursuit. The crocodiles had vanished beneath the surface, but he knew they were still there, following him through the underwater channels with predatory patience. They had marked him now, marked his scent, and they wouldn't give up until they had finished what they'd started. When he reached Wade's property, his neighbor was waiting on the dock with a rifle in his hands and a grim expression on his weathered face. "Heard the commotion from a mile away," Wade said, helping Gideon tie off the boat. "Sounded like a war out there." "It was," Gideon replied, his clothes still dripping marsh water mixed with blood, his own and the crocodiles. "And it's not finished. They'll follow me back. Tonight, maybe tomorrow, but they'll come." Wade studied the bite marks on Gideon's knife and the tears in his shirt where claws had nearly found their mark. "How many?" "4, maybe more." Gideon checked his weapon, wiping the blade clean on his wet shirt. "The one I wounded won't be moving fast. But the others..." He paused, remembering the intelligence he'd seen in their eyes, the way they'd coordinated their attack. "They're not just animals, Wade. They're thinking, planning." The 2 men walked quickly toward Gideon's property, Wade's rifle held ready, and both of them scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But it was what they found at Gideon's house that made both men break into a run. Violet stood on the front porch with Clarabelle pressed against her side, both of them staring toward the creek that ran behind their property. Even from a distance, Gideon could see what had frightened them. Fresh tracks led from the water to within 20 feet of the house, massive indentations in the soft earth that could only have been made by something large and heavy, dragging itself across the ground. "They were here an hour ago," Violet said when Gideon reached her. Clarabelle saw them from her bedroom window, 3 of them, just watching the house. Gideon's blood turned cold. The crocodiles hadn't followed him home. They had come here first, while he was still fighting for his life on the island. They had been learning his family's routines, studying the layout of his property. This had never been about cattle or territory. It had been about eliminating the one threat to their expansion into new hunting grounds. "Pack your things," Gideon told Violet. "Enough for a few days. You and Clarabelle are going to stay with your sister in town until this is finished." "And what about you?" Violet demanded. "You can't fight those things alone, not 4 of them." But Gideon was already moving, his mind working through a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. Possibly both. "I'm not going to fight them," he said, disappearing into the barn. "I'm going to make them fight each other." When he emerged, he was carrying a coil of heavy rope, 2 metal stakes, and a hammer. Wade watched him work, recognition dawning on his face as Gideon began driving the stakes deep into the ground near the creek's edge. "You're building a trap," Wade said. "But what makes you think they'll fall for it?" Gideon finished securing the rope between the stakes, creating a snare just beneath the water's surface. "Because they're confident now. They think they've got me beaten, got my family cornered. Confident predators make mistakes." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Gideon sent his family away with Wade. He stood alone on his property, watching the first shadows creep across the landscape. In the distance he could hear them coming, the sound of massive bodies moving through water, getting closer with each passing minute. But this time, he wasn't running into their territory as prey. This time, they were coming into his, and he had spent the last hour preparing a welcome they would never forget. The first crocodile appeared at the water's edge, just as full darkness fell, its eyes reflecting the lamplight from Gideon's house, like twin stars in the black water. It was time to finish what they had started. The first crocodile emerged from the creek with the confidence of an apex predator, entering its own territory. Gideon watched from behind the cover of his barn, every muscle tense as the massive reptile hauled itself onto his land. The trap he'd set was simple but effective. A rope snare positioned just below the waterline, anchored to stakes driven deep into the creek bed. But the crocodile was too smart to rush forward blindly. It stopped at the water's edge, scanning the area with those ancient, calculating eyes. Gideon knew he had to make the first move, draw them in before they sensed the trap. He stepped out into the lamplight, making himself visible. The crocodile's head swiveled toward him immediately, and Gideon heard the low rumble that came from deep in its throat, a sound like distant thunder that promised violence. Behind the first beast, 2 more shapes emerged from the creek, forming a semicircle around Gideon's position. The wounded crocodile was not among them. Gideon hoped that meant his knife had done more damage than he'd realized, but he couldn't count on that. 3 was still more than enough to kill him if his plan failed. Gideon began backing toward the barn, moving slowly and deliberately. The crocodiles followed, staying in formation, cutting off any chance of escape. When he reached the barn door, he turned and ran inside, hearing the rush of movement behind him as the predators charged forward. The first crocodile hit the snare at full speed. The rope caught its front legs and yanked tight, sending the massive creature tumbling sideways into the creek with a splash that echoed across the landscape. But instead of stopping to help their companion, the other 2 crocodiles continued their pursuit, their focus entirely on the prey that had eluded them once before. Gideon had counted on that. Crocodiles were opportunistic hunters, and a struggling, trapped animal was easier prey than a human with a knife. As the 2 remaining predators converged on the thrashing beast in the snare, Gideon circled around behind them. The trapped crocodile's struggles had become frantic, its powerful tail whipping through the water and creating a disturbance that drew the others closer. When the first of the remaining crocodiles moved in to investigate, Gideon struck. He drove his knife down between the creature's shoulder blades, angling the blade toward its heart. The crocodile spun around with shocking speed, nearly tearing the knife from Gideon's grip. But the wound was deep and well placed. Blood poured from the gash, and the beast's movements became sluggish, uncoordinated. It retreated into deeper water, leaving a dark trail behind it. 1 down, 2 to go. The third crocodile had learned from watching its companion's mistakes. Instead of charging blindly, it approached with careful deliberation, staying just out of knife range while searching for an opening. This was the leader, Gideon realized, the one that had orchestrated the attack on his property, the one smart enough to hang back and let the others test his defenses. For several minutes, predator and prey circled each other in the shallow water. The trapped crocodile had stopped struggling, exhausted by its efforts to break free. The wounded one had disappeared entirely, either dead or retreating to heal. It was just Gideon and the leader now, and both of them knew only one would walk away from this confrontation. The crocodile made its move just as Gideon's attention wavered for a split second. It came at him low and fast, jaws wide enough to take his leg off at the knee. But Gideon had been waiting for exactly this moment. Instead of retreating, he stepped forward and drove his knife down with all his strength, aiming for the soft spot behind the creature's eyes. The blade sank deep, and the crocodile's charge became a death roll, spinning through the water with Gideon still holding the knife. He felt ribs crack as the massive tail struck him, but he held on, driving the blade deeper until the thrashing finally stopped. Silence settled over the creek like a blanket, broken only by Gideon's labored breathing and the gentle lapping of water against the bank. Dawn broke over the Flint Ranch to find Gideon sitting on the creek bank, cleaning his father's hunting knife with methodical precision. The water around him was stained dark, and three massive shapes floated motionless in the shallows. The trapped crocodile had drowned during the night, exhausted by its struggles against the rope that had pulled tighter with every movement. Gideon's ribs ached where the dying leader had struck him, and deep scratches marked his arms and chest. But he was alive. More importantly, the threat to his family was eliminated. 4 apex predators that had terrorized the marsh for years were finally dead, their reign of terror ended by a rancher with nothing more than determination and a sharp blade. When Wade arrived with Violet and Clarabelle an hour later, they found Gideon dragging the last of the carcasses onto dry land. The sight of her husband, bloodied but victorious, standing over the creatures that had threatened their home, brought tears to Violet's eyes. "It's over?" she asked, though she could see the answer in his steady gaze. "It's over," Gideon confirmed. "They won't be taking any more cattle or threatening any more families." Clarabelle ran to her father, wrapping her small arms around his waist despite the blood and marsh water that still clung to his clothes. "I knew you'd win, Papa," she said with the absolute faith that only a child could possess. "I knew you'd keep us safe." Wade surveyed the scene with the eye of an experienced rancher. "Biggest crocodiles I've ever seen," he said, walking around the largest carcass. "This one must be 15 feet if it's an inch. No wonder they were so bold. They'd been ruling this marsh for decades." Over the following days, word of Gideon's victory spread throughout the county. Other ranchers came to see the proof for themselves, and several offered to buy the crocodile hides for substantial sums. But Gideon kept only what he needed to repair the damage to his property and donated the rest to the local church fund. The real change, however, was in Gideon himself. The experience had stripped away any illusions about the comfortable safety of civilization. He began teaching Clarabelle how to handle a rifle, insisted that Violet learn to shoot as well, and never again ventured far from the house without being armed and alert. But there was something else too. A quiet confidence that came from facing his worst fears and emerging victorious. When other ranchers brought him their problems with predators or rustlers, they found Gideon willing to help in ways that didn't involve putting his own family at risk. He became known throughout the region as a man who understood both the value of peaceful solutions and the necessity of decisive action when peace failed. 3 months later, as Gideon stood watching Clarabelle practice her shooting at tin cans lined up on the fence posts, Violet joined him on the porch. "Any regrets?" she asked, following his gaze toward the creek where cattails now grew undisturbed and cattle grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. Gideon considered the question seriously. The nightmares had faded, his ribs had healed, and his family was safe. The marsh was quiet now, home only to the birds and fish that belonged there. Magnus had been the last animal they would lose to predators that had no place in his world. "None," he said finally. "A man protects what's his. That's not something to regret." As the sun set over the peaceful ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Flint family sat down to dinner together, secure in the knowledge that some threats, when faced with enough courage and determination, could be ended permanently. The crocodiles were gone, the marsh was safe, and life could continue as it should, with hard work, family, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes a man with a knife and the will to use it was enough to change everything. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.
Homeless girl shares her only coat with freezing dog. What happens next is unthinkable. On the coldest night of the year, a homeless girl gave her only blanket to a shivering dog. not knowing that a simple act of kindness would lead her back to everything she thought she'd lost: a family, a future, and a reason to believe again. If you've ever felt alone but kept going, this story is for you. Chicago, in the deep clutch of January, did not welcome strangers, or its own. The wind screeched down alleyways like a warning, biting at exposed skin and lashing ice into the faces of anyone unfortunate enough to walk its streets after dark. Snow covered the sidewalks in jagged patches, blackened at the edges by passing tires and forgotten footsteps. The street lamps flickered in weak protest, casting their dim halos over a city frozen in place. Beneath the elevated train tracks near 63rd Street, where cold steel met brick walls covered in faded graffiti, a girl moved through the frost-laced shadows like a figure cut from smoke. Her name was Harper Brooks. 17, shoulders squared against the wind as if defiance alone could keep her warm. She was small-boned, but carried herself with a quiet strength, the kind born not of confidence but of survival. Her skin was a warm walnut brown, dulled slightly by soot and winter, and her hair, thick, coiled tightly into a messy bun, peeked out from under a knit beanie that had seen better days. The olive-green coat wrapped around her was too big, clearly from a man's closet, with a broken zipper and threadbare sleeves. Her jeans were torn at the knees, not by style but by time. Her shoes, mismatched and duct-taped at the soles, made dull, wet sounds with every step. Harper had been on the streets for nearly a year, ever since the apartment she shared with her mother went up in flames. Her mom hadn't made it out. Her father, long estranged and locked away on drug charges, never came. Since then, Harper had lived between shelters, church basements, and unlit corners of the city no one cared to name. She had learned quickly how to disappear, how to walk like she had somewhere to go, how to stare straight ahead so no one asked questions, how to keep quiet until she was alone. That night, the snow had turned to ice, slick and sharp. Harper's fingers had gone numb hours ago. She crossed into an alley behind an abandoned liquor store, looking for a place out of the wind. She knew there was an old shipping container behind the loading dock that sometimes stayed dry if you curled up in the right corner. As she stepped toward it, a low sound caught her ear. A whimper, strained and broken. She stopped, listened. There it was again. Not a cat, not a human, something deeper, sadder. Harper approached the edge of the alley cautiously. Behind a stack of discarded pallets and frozen garbage bags, she saw it. A dog. A large golden retriever, curled into itself like a dropped bundle of fur and ribs. Its coat was matted, dirty, and partially iced over, especially near the tail. One of its front paws was bent at an odd angle, and it trembled violently, eyes half shut, but watching her through a narrow slit of caution and exhaustion. Harper crouched slowly, heart thudding. "Hey there," she said, voice raspy from the cold. "You okay, buddy?" The dog didn't move, but it didn't growl either. It looked at her, really looked, and something inside her shifted. She glanced down at her coat. It barely kept her warm, but she could see it now. This dog wouldn't last the night, not out here, not alone. Cursing under her breath, Harper shrugged out of her jacket and stepped closer. The cold hit her skin like punishment. She knelt, draped the coat gently over the dog's back, and then sat down beside it. The ground stole the warmth from her legs instantly. The dog shifted slightly and let out a small groan, then pressed itself against her hip. "Guess you don't mind sharing," she muttered. She sat there in silence, one hand resting on the dog's head, the other buried in her hoodie pocket. The dog exhaled shakily. Harper's breath clouded the air like smoke. "I'll call you Sonny," she whispered. "Not because you are, but maybe you will be." Far from the frozen alley, on the quieter edges of Hyde Park, Malcolm Hayes sat alone in a kitchen that no longer felt like a home. A former K-9 trainer in his late 50s, Malcolm had the look of a man who'd once been powerful. Broad shoulders, square jaw, hands calloused from decades of discipline and purpose, but now moved as if the air itself was heavier. His hair was more gray than black, pulled back in a short, neat ponytail. His eyes, pale green and deeply lined, rarely looked up from his coffee mug anymore. He had lost his wife, Helen, 2 winters ago to cancer, and shortly after he lost Cooper, his most trusted therapy dog. One night, Cooper had vanished from their backyard during a storm. No sign of struggle, no paw prints past the fence, just gone. The house had grown quiet since. Malcolm no longer trained dogs. The leash hooks remained untouched by the door, and Cooper's bed in the corner was still there, undisturbed, as though Malcolm couldn't bear to remove it. Grief had a way of freezing time. That night, Malcolm sat at the table, flipping through an old notebook of canine training logs. He paused at a sketch Helen had made of Cooper's face, ears alert, tongue lolling, the kind of expression that made you believe in kindness. "Where'd you go, boy?" Malcolm murmured into the silence. Back in the alley, Harper leaned her head against the brick wall and closed her eyes. The wind had dulled. Sunny, though still trembling, had stopped shivering so violently. She wrapped her arms around herself and listened to the steady rhythm of his breath. For now, for one cold night, neither of them was alone. Morning broke over Chicago in hesitant shades of gray filtering through the iron skeleton of the city, like it wasn't quite sure it belonged. The air was still biting cold, but the snowfall had slowed, and a thin crust of ice formed over everything. Benches, gutters, newspaper boxes, and the city's tired people who stirred slowly back into motion. Under the overpass, Harper Brooks shifted awake to the sensation of warm breath against her leg. Sonny was still there, his golden coat dulled by dirt but radiant in the pale morning light. He blinked up at her with quiet trust, his ribs still visible but his eyes no longer dull. Harper sat up, hugging her arms against her chest. Her teeth chattered violently. She didn't have a plan, she never really had one, but she knew they had to move. The cold would only worsen once the wind picked up again. She stood slowly, knees cracking, and Sonny struggled upright beside her. He limped on his injured front paw but made no sound of pain. Instead, he leaned gently against her leg, waiting. Harper looked down at him. "Guess we're stuck with each other now, huh?" They made their way toward one of the busier train stations downtown, Union Station, a place Harper had frequented when she needed warmth and motion. The security guards there weren't always kind, but if you moved around often enough, they usually let you be. Harper walked with her hood low and her pace steady. Sonny trotted beside her, limping but alert ears perked at every passing sound. Several people glanced at them but quickly looked away. A girl of 17 with a worn-out dog didn't invite attention, and she knew better than to ask for it. By mid-morning, they had found a dry patch of ground just outside the terminal. Harper sat against a steel column, unpacked her crumpled paper bag, and offered half-a-day-old bagel she'd scavenged the night before. She tore it in two, handing the larger piece to Sonny. He sniffed it, then looked at her as if waiting for permission. "Go ahead," she said with a tired smile. "You've earned it." He ate delicately with small, careful bites. It wasn't just hunger she saw in him. It was gratitude. While the station bustled behind them, commuters in coats, mothers tugging children, businessmen on phones. Harper began to hum softly. It was a habit she had held on to from childhood. Her mother used to hum spirituals while washing dishes or folding laundry songs about rivers and redemption and God's quiet mercy. Harper didn't believe in much anymore, but humming made the silence less sharp. A man stopped nearby, tossing a few coins into an empty coffee cup beside her. He was tall and lean, wearing a Cubs beanie and a face that said he hadn't slept well in years. "Nice voice," he muttered, barely making eye contact. You ever think of singing somewhere Harper didn't respond? People like him didn't expect answers. Sonny, sensing her discomfort, moved slightly closer and sat with his back pressed to hers, his body acting like a shield. That moment, small and quiet as it was, became part of a different story, one unfolding several neighborhoods away. In a modest townhouse filled with morning shadows and the smell of reheated coffee, Malcolm Hayes sat hunched over his kitchen table, squinting at his phone. He wasn't one for social media, but Ramona Caldwell had sent him a link via text the night before. "You need to see this," she had written. It was a video grainy vertical and taken from a subway platform. It showed a girl young and hunched over singing something soft and mournful while a dirty golden retriever lay beside her. The video was under a minute, captioned only, "This voice and this dog." Why is no one helping them? Malcolm had watched it 4 times already. He stared now at the dog's posture, at the way it kept glancing at the girl as if tethered to her soul. He noted the injured paw, the coat still gleaming despite the filth and the strange serenity in the animal's eyes. For a second, just one, he had hoped, but that hope faded as quickly as it came. The dog in the video was too young, its frame was leaner, and most importantly, its eyes lacked the stormy intensity that had defined Cooper. Still, something about the way the dog leaned into the girl, the way it waited for her to move before doing anything, it felt familiar. It reminded him not of a specific dog, but of a connection, of what he once had. Malcolm rubbed the back of his neck, then stood and poured himself another cup of coffee. His kitchen was simple sunflower curtains, clean countertops, and a breakfast table littered with unopened mail. A photo of Helen, his late wife, rested on the windowsill. She had been a middle school art teacher, all freckles, and fire always trying to convince him to paint instead of bark commands. Malcolm had trained hundreds of dogs over his career, but it had been Helen who taught him how to read the soul behind their eyes. He looked at her photo now and whispered, "You'd tell me to go find that girl, wouldn't you?" He picked up the phone again and saved the video. Back near Union Station, Harper and Sonny had moved to a more discreet corner near the platform's edge. The wind had picked up and she buried her hands into the pockets of her hoodie. Sonny rested his head on her thigh, sighing deeply as if this brief moment of stillness was worth treasuring. A woman passed by with a stroller, pausing to glance down. "That's a beautiful dog," she said gently. Harper nodded without looking up. Compliments didn't feed bellies. But something in the woman's voice hadn't been pity. It had been acknowledgement. Later, when the crowds thinned, Harper sang again, not loudly, but just enough to let her voice wrap around the shadows. Sonny remained perfectly still beside her, his ears twitching at the smallest sound. A man walking by dropped $1 into her coffee cup. Another offered a wrapped granola bar. One woman, young in scrubs, paused, squatted down, and asked softly, "What's his name?" "Sonny Harper," answered. The woman smiled. "He suits it." As the sky dimmed toward late afternoon, Harper leaned back, watching her breath curl in the air. She reached down and scratched behind Sonny's ear. "I don't know where we're going," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I hope it's somewhere warm." Sonny nudged her hand in return, and Harper allowed herself just for a second to believe that maybe warmth wasn't just a place but something you could carry with you. The sun hovered low behind a thick sheet of clouds as another day unfolded in the heart of Chicago. The gray tones of winter bled into everything: steel beams, brick facades, even the faces of people who moved through the station like ghosts. Harper Brooks sat cross-legged on the concrete just outside the Union Station's eastern entrance, her back pressed against a vending machine plastered with peeling ads. Her cheeks were raw from the wind, and her fingers curled tight around the handle of a styrofoam coffee cup. Not for warmth, there was none but to hold the few coins and crumpled dollar bills that passers-by occasionally dropped. Sonny lay at her feet, head resting on his paws, his golden coat cleaner than it had been days before but still dulled by soot and slush. His injured paw had started to heal. Harper had found some antibiotic cream in a community center's free box and applied it as gently as she could. He didn't whimper anymore, though he still limped. His eyes followed every motion around them, a child skipping by a man with too many bags, a pair of pigeons strutting near a sandwich crust. Alert, aware, protective. Harper cleared her throat. She had learned to sing softly here, not loud enough to draw attention from security, but just enough to catch ears. Her voice husky with cold but smooth as velvet rose in careful verses of wayfaring stranger, the notes floating like steam into the city noise. She didn't sing to impress. She sang to survive. Sometimes the right melody opened wallets. More importantly, it gave her something to hold on to. From across the plaza, a woman stood watching. She was in her mid-50s, tall and slim, her silver-gray hair pulled into a low bun beneath a wide-collared wool coat. Her face bore the kind of elegant strength that came from a lifetime of choosing compassion in hard places, high cheekbones, thin lips, soft lines around eyes that missed nothing. Her name was Ramona Caldwell, and she was the director of the Midwest Center for Canine Therapy, a quiet but respected facility located just outside the city in Oak Park. A former vet tech turned animal behaviorist, Ramona had a reputation for seeing potential where others saw brokenness both in dogs and in people. She watched Harper for several minutes, not moving, not speaking. She studied the way the girl swayed slightly with the rhythm of her song, how she glanced protectively at the dog each time someone walked too close. Sonny, too, caught her attention. The posture, the patience, the stillness that wasn't fear but something closer to discipline. He wasn't just any stray. That dog had been trained once well. Ramona stepped forward, approaching slowly. Harper saw her coming and went quiet, tensing slightly. Sonny lifted his head but didn't growl. Instead, he gave a low wag of his tail just once and then rested his chin again. Ramona crouched down with careful grace, not too close hands resting on her knees. "That's a beautiful voice," she said gently, her tone professional but warm. "You sing like someone who's lived through a lot." Harper studied her warily. She had met enough outreach workers and pitying strangers to know when someone wanted something. "I'm not begging," she said, tone flat. "I didn't say you were." Ramona smiled, tilting her head. "What's his name? Sonny?" Harper's voice softened. "He suits it," Ramona replied. "I'm Ramona." Harper didn't offer her name. Ramona reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a business card, and placed it carefully near the coffee cup. "I run a place just outside the city. We train therapy dogs. Sometimes we help people too. No pressure, no expectations. Just if you ever need somewhere warm." She stood, nodded at Sonny, and walked away. Harper didn't pick up the card until 10 minutes later. She didn't throw it away. That evening, in a modest office filled with dog leashes, framed certificates, and soft jazz playing through a dusty speaker, Ramona sat behind her desk, video paused on her computer screen. It was the same clip from before Harper singing under the station light, Sonny at her feet. She hit play again, watching frame by frame, pausing at Sonny's raised head and calm, steady eyes. Her office door creaked open and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped inside. He wore a worn brown coat, faded jeans, and a look of restrained expectation. Malcolm Hayes, 58. Once a pillar in the canine training world, now stood slightly hunched from years of emotional weight more than physical labor. His eyes, pale green and ringed with fatigue, scanned the screen before even greeting her. "Well?" he asked. Ramona turned the monitor toward him. "That's the dog. And the girl." Malcolm stepped closer. "Does it look like Cooper to you?" Ramona was quiet for a moment. "The build's close," Coat too. But the eyes... No. Cooper had sharper features. More muscle in the back legs. This one's younger. Maybe 4. Cooper would be 7 now. Malcolm exhaled, stepping back, one hand resting on the back of his neck. I thought, maybe... I understand, Ramona said gently. I wanted to believe too. Malcolm nodded more to himself than her. What about the girl? She's cautious, Ramona said, but there's fire in her. And she's kind. She shared her coat with that dog. I saw them yesterday. After she helped him through a crowd, he stayed glued to her side the whole time. Not panicked. Focused. She trained him, I doubt it. But I think someone did. That dog has canine manners. I wouldn't be surprised if he used to be in a program, or belonged to someone who was. Malcolm looked at the paused video again. What's her name? She didn't say. He sighed. You gonna try again? Ramona leaned back in her chair. She's on edge. I'll let her come to me. She took the card. That's a start. Malcolm gave a short nod, then turned to go. Let me know if anything changes. At the door, Ramona called softly. You doing okay, Mal? He didn't turn. I will be. Later that night, Harper and Sonny sat on a metal grate near the rear of a laundromat that vented warm air from its dryers. Sonny's head rested in her lap as she absent-mindedly ran her fingers through his coat. The business card sat folded in her pocket. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, someone had seen her not as a problem to be solved or a shadow to avoid, but as a person. That didn't change everything, but it was something. And something was more than nothing. Chicago's wind that night didn't whisper, it howled. It tore through alleyways and curled beneath coats, finding every unguarded inch of skin like it had a score to settle. Snow fell sideways under the amber glow of flickering street lamps, blurring the edges of the world. Harper Brooks moved quickly, clutching a plastic grocery bag against her chest, its contents rattling a stale sandwich, a wool scarf missing one end, and a nearly empty water bottle. Her breath came in shallow clouds, her body tense from exhaustion and something deeper unease. Beside her, Sonny trotted quietly, his limp more noticeable after the long day. His coat had darkened from snow and grime, but his spirit remained steady. Ears alert, tail low, he kept to Harper's left, always between her and the street. Harper had planned to sleep near the laundromat again on the metal vent that puffed out warm, drier air through the night. But when they arrived, 2 older men already occupied the spot, both wrapped in sleeping bags, eyes closed but fists tight around their belongings. Harper didn't blame them. Out here, survival was a silent contest of priority. Come on, we'll find another place, she muttered to Sonny, who gave no protest, only stayed close as they turned down a side alley. The snow deepened here, less trodden, the kind that whispered danger in every footstep. Harper spotted a recessed service doorway behind an old deli half shielded from the wind dry enough. She knelt, brushing aside a heap of papers to create space, then laid down a flattened cardboard box as insulation. It's not much, she whispered, but at least it's quiet. Sonny circled once, then lay down beside her, his body against hers. Harper pulled the scarf around her neck and let her eyes close. Just for a moment. Just long enough to forget she didn't belong to any place anymore. But the silence didn't last. Footsteps. Heavy. Purposeful. She opened her eyes, heart already racing. 3 figures emerged from the mouth of the alley. Young men, maybe late teens or early 20s, bundled in patchwork coats and layered hoodies, their eyes sharp with desperation. The tallest walked in front, his hood casting a shadow over a long, narrow face, marked by a thin scar running from temple to jaw. The second one had a nervous twitch, adjusting his cap every few seconds. The third, shorter, broader, walked with a slight limp. Well, what do we have here? the tall one said, his voice low and almost amused. Harper stood, bag clutched to her chest. I'm not looking for trouble. The twitchy one laughed. Too bad. Trouble's looking for you. Sonny growled a low, guttural warning. He stepped in front of Harper, his body rigid, head low, his lips curled just slightly. Call off the mutt, Scarface sneered. Or I will. Please, Harper said, her voice shaking. I don't have anything. You sang all day? The broad one replied. We saw you. We want what you made. I don't have cash. She backed against the wall. Twitchy lunged first, grabbing for her bag. Sonny sprang before Harper could blink. His body hit the man's legs with full force, knocking him sideways into the snow. Sonny snarled a deep, primal sound that echoed off brick. Twitchy screamed as sharp teeth sank into his jacket sleeve. Get him off me, the broad one shouted, raising a boot. No! Harper screamed, but it was too late. The boot connected with Sonny's ribs. A sharp yelp pierced the air. He stumbled but didn't retreat. Instead, he turned, growling louder, baring his teeth with such fury that the broad one took a step back. Scarface pulled a piece of metal pipe from his jacket. Last chance. Before he could swing, a blinding flashlight beam cut through the alley. Hey! A commanding voice rang out. Back off! The attackers turned. Ramona Caldwell stood at the alley's edge, her coat flapping, flashlight in one hand and phone in the other. Police are on their way, she said coolly. You've got 30 seconds to disappear. The boys hesitated, weighing their chances. Then, without a word, they scattered into the snow, leaving behind footprints and adrenaline. Harper collapsed to her knees beside Sonny. He was panting, hard, side-heaving. She ran her hands down his body, feeling for broken bones, her breath caught between sobs. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, I didn't know. She buried her face into his fur. He whimpered but licked her cheek in return. Ramona approached slowly, her expression unreadable beneath the sharp planes of her face. Her silver hair was damp with snow, her gloved hand extended. He needs a vet. Harper didn't answer. She couldn't look up. Ramona knelt beside them, her voice softer now. There's a free clinic. I know the vet. She's good and kind. Let me help you. Please. Harper finally raised her eyes. She saw something in the woman's face that she hadn't seen in years' steadiness. No pity, no judgment. Just presence. 20 minutes later, they were inside the back entrance of the Lakeshore Street Animal Clinic. It smelled like antiseptic and lavender. A woman in her 30s, Dr. Lena Park, Korean-American petite, with clear glasses and a confident stride, ushered Sonny onto the exam table with practiced calm. He's bruised maybe a cracked rib, Lena said after the checkup, but no internal bleeding. He's a tough one. Harper hovered nearby, clutching a borrowed blanket around her shoulders. Ramona sat beside her, explaining quietly how the clinic helped the city's homeless pet owners, how this wasn't charity, it was community. Lena smiled at Harper. You've been taking good care of him. I tried, Harper whispered. Sonny, tail thumping faintly, let out a sigh and rested his head on Harper's thigh. Outside, the snow had begun to slow. Street lamps cast long shadows across slick pavement. Ramona handed Harper a thermos. Hot cider. I keep a stash in the clinic's break room for emergencies. This counts. Harper held it with both hands, absorbing the warmth. Why are you helping me? Ramona looked ahead. Because I've met people who didn't, and I decided I'd never be one of them. A silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Ramona added, There's someone I think you should meet. His name's Malcolm Hayes. He used to train dogs. I think he'd see what I see in you. Harper frowned. I'm not special. Ramona smiled, then gestured to Sonny, now resting peacefully under a blanket. Tell him that. The morning light filtered through the frosted windows of Lakeshore Street Animal Clinic, soft and golden, cutting through the antiseptic white of the exam room like a gentle reassurance that maybe for once things were going to be okay. Harper sat on the edge of a vinyl chair, shoulders wrapped in a donated flannel blanket, one foot tapping the floor restlessly. Beside her, Sonny dozed on a padded mat, his breath slow and even, a small shaved patch on his rib cage where the vet had treated the bruising from the night before. Harper kept glancing at the door, unsure whether to run or wait. Something about the way Ramona had said, "He might understand you," more than anyone had lodged in her gut. She didn't like strangers, especially older men. Experience had taught her they noticed for the wrong reasons or looked away when they should have helped. But Ramona had not just helped, she had seen her. That meant something. The door opened with a soft jingle. The man who stepped in was tall, broad, and carried the weight of memory in every line of his face. His name was Malcolm Hayes, and at 58 he looked like a man who had both trained greatness and buried it. His beard was salt and pepper trimmed but rugged, and his green eyes ringed with tiredness were the kind that studied without judgment. He wore a navy field jacket, jeans, and boots dusted with the city's salt and snow. His hands were calloused yet gentle-looking dogman hands. Harper stood slowly, not out of politeness, but instinct. Malcolm's eyes didn't go to her first. They went to the dog. Sonny had raised his head the moment the man walked in, not in fear, but with an eerie familiarity. His ears perked, his body stiffened like a soldier recognizing a command, but then relaxed just as quickly. Then without warning he stood limped once and padded forward. Harper's heart jumped. "Sonny, wait." But Sonny didn't bark or growl. He simply approached Malcolm with cautious reverence, tail wagging gently as if some distant thread had pulled him toward this man with quiet certainty. Malcolm crouched slowly. Sonny sniffed his hand, then pressed his head into the man's palm. Harper froze. Her throat tightened. Was he going to claim him? Was this the moment she lost everything again? "Easy, boy," Malcolm murmured, running his hand along Sonny's back. "You've been through it, haven't you?" Then his fingers found something just above Sonny's left leg, a faint, healed-over scar. Malcolm exhaled slowly. Ramona, leaning against the doorframe behind them, spoke. "It's not Cooper." "I know," Malcolm said, voice low. Cooper's scar was on the right near the flank. This one's older, deeper. Different dog. He looked up at Harper. She stood, rooted arms crossed tightly over her chest, gaze defensive but trembling. "I'm not here to take him," Malcolm said gently. Harper didn't answer, but her shoulders lowered just slightly. "I used to train dogs like him," he continued. "He's special. I can see that. And so can you." Sonny trotted back to her side, brushing his body against her knee like a living anchor. Harper reached down, stroking his ears. "He saved my life," she muttered. Malcolm nodded. "Looks like he'd do it again." There was a pause. The kind that stretches when people are figuring out whether trust has space to grow. Ramona stepped forward. "Malcolm has room at his place, lots of it. I was thinking, maybe Harper and Sonny could stay there for a bit, just until we figure out next steps." Harper stiffened again. "Not as charity," Ramona added. "As a partnership. You help Malcolm around the property, learn from him. He trains dogs. You've got instincts. I think you'd surprise yourself." Malcolm watched her carefully. "Your call. You're not a case. You're a person. And you and that dog, you've already done more than most." Harper didn't reply, but she looked down at Sonny, who sat calmly at her feet, gazing up at her with those steady brown eyes. Later that day, a black pickup pulled up in front of a modest two-story house, nestled near the edge of an overgrown park on the city's western edge. The siding was old but intact, the porch neatly swept, and wind chimes sang in the breeze, clinking like distant laughter. Malcolm opened the passenger door and let Harper step down, Sonny leaping beside her. She glanced up at the home, unsure. "This is your place." "Yup. House is bigger than I need," Malcolm said, grabbing a duffel of blankets Ramona had packed for them. "You'll stay upstairs. There's a spare bedroom. Bathroom's down the hall. Sonny's welcome inside. Always." They walked into a living room lined with books, framed photos, and most noticeably a series of ribbons and certificates hanging above the mantel. A younger Malcolm beamed in one standing beside a gleaming golden retriever with a sharp expression Cooper. Harper studied the photo. "He looks like Sonny," she said. Malcolm smiled a bit wistfully. "Yeah, but they're not the same. Cooper was intense, focused. Sonny, he's got something softer, like he was made to protect someone's heart, not just their body." Harper didn't know what to say, but the words stayed with her. That night she lay in the upstairs bedroom on a real bed for the first time in months. Sonny curled beside her, his tail thumping once before stilling. Through the window she saw snowflakes beginning to fall again, but this time she wasn't afraid. This time there were walls, a roof, and someone downstairs who didn't look at her like a burden. She whispered into the dark hand resting on Sonny's back. "We're not lost anymore. Not really." Sonny stirred in his sleep and nudged closer. The snow had slowed to a hush outside the windows of Malcolm Hayes's house, blanketing the yard in a soft white that muffled every sound but the creak of old floorboards and the occasional distant bark from a neighbor's dog. Inside, warmth bloomed from the fireplace in the living room, where logs crackled softly beneath a brass mantel. Harper Brooks sat curled on the edge of the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, a mug of lukewarm tea cradled in her palms. Sonny lay at her feet, head resting on one paw, the firelight dancing across his golden fur. It had been 2 days since she and Sonny moved in. The guest room upstairs was modest but clean, with soft sheets, a patchwork quilt, and a small lamp shaped like a lighthouse. There was a closet half filled with old coats that still smelled faintly of cedar, and a dusty bookshelf holding dog-eared copies of novels by Toni Morrison and Steinbeck. Malcolm hadn't hovered. He had shown her where the towels were, how to work the shower, and where the cereal was stored, then let her find her rhythm. Harper appreciated the space. Trust was like frostbite. It took a long time to thaw. That afternoon, Malcolm had gone into the garage to sort through supplies. Harper wandered. She hadn't explored the house much, but something about the silence invited her deeper. She found herself standing before a closed door off the hallway. It was slightly ajar, revealing the edge of a lace curtain and warm wood panels. Inside was a room drenched in soft gold light, and at the center of it a piano. It was an upright Baldwin old, but well cared for its finish, polished to a warm honey sheen. A vase of silk flowers rested atop it, along with a framed photo of a woman with auburn curls and a laugh caught mid-motion. Harper stepped inside as if in a trance, her fingertips brushing the keys. She hadn't played in years, but some things lived in the bones. She sat down and pressed a key. Then another. A few sour notes at first, her fingers stiff with disuse. But then came a progression minor, slow, mournful. It was an old gospel hymn, something her mother had played on their thrift store keyboard back when their living room was still full of life and music and weekend breakfasts. She played tentatively at first, then more boldly, the melody pulling something loose inside her chest. Halfway through, her hands trembled. By the final notes, she was crying. Silent tears falling freely down her cheeks, her shoulders hunched as if trying to fold into herself. Sonny had come in quietly, nudging her knee before settling beside her feet again like a shadow. What Harper didn't know was that Malcolm stood in the hallway, the door just slightly cracked, listening. He hadn't heard that hymn in years. His wife Helen had played it often on Sunday mornings and rainy days, sometimes after funerals when silence was too heavy. The sound now coming from Harper's hands wasn't just a melody. It was memory, and loss, and maybe something trying to grow in its place. When the last note faded, Malcolm quietly stepped away and returned to the garage. Some moments weren't meant to be interrupted. Later that evening, Harper found him in the kitchen chopping sweet potatoes with methodical calm. The room smelled of rosemary and olive oil. "You play?" he asked, without looking up. Harper paused. "I used to. Not for a while." She would have liked that. Helen. That was her room. Harper nodded, but said nothing. Malcolm glanced at her, then back at the cutting board. "Music's good. Makes the walls feel less empty." The next morning, Harper was out back tossing a ball for Sonny in the snow-covered yard. Despite his limp, Sonny chased it with a joyful energy, kicking up flurries as he bounded across the space. Malcolm watched from the porch, arms crossed, a smile tugging the corner of his mouth. "Ever notice how he watches you?" Malcolm said when Harper returned with Sonny at her side. "What do you mean? He waits for your cues. Keeps his body between you and any door. That's not just loyalty. That's training therapy dog instinct." Harper looked down at Sonny. "He just knows what I need." Malcolm nodded. "Exactly." He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and dialed. A moment later, Ramona's warm voice came through. "I think I've got something," he said. "Harper. She's not just a survivor. She's got touch, natural understanding. And Sonny, he's special. I think we ought to give them a real shot." Ramona agreed. She offered a position in informal apprenticeship training Harper to become a canine therapy assistant at the center. They'd start with basics, handling commands, reading canine behavior, shadowing real therapy sessions. It wasn't a job. Not yet. But it was a path. When Malcolm told Harper that evening, she was quiet. Then she said, "Do you think I can really do it?" "I think you already are," he replied. That night, Harper returned to the music room and played again. This time a little stronger, a little steadier. Sonny curled up beside the piano bench, and Malcolm listened once more from the hallway, letting the music wrap around him like an old quilt. The days were growing longer in Chicago, the light returning in slow but certain strokes across the skyline. Spring had begun to stretch its fingers through the frost-bitten city, softening the ground and waking the trees with hints of green. On the west edge of town, where the old Hayes home stood with its weathered porch and sun-warmed wood siding, something else was beginning to bloom too. Harper Brooks. At 17, Harper no longer flinched at every knock on the door or shadow on the street. Her braids were tighter now, her clothes cleaner, her eyes less guarded though still watchful. She walked taller, spoke more often, and spent her mornings in classrooms instead of alleys. Malcolm had helped her enroll in a part-time GED program at the Community Learning Center just a short bus ride away. The first day, she had nearly backed out, nerves knotted in her stomach like cold metal. But Sonny had trotted beside her all the way to the bus stop, sitting with perfect calm, his presence saying, "You've got this." She had smiled at him, rubbed his ear, and gone. It turned out Harper wasn't just smart. She was sharp. She asked the right questions, listened carefully, and soaked up knowledge with the hunger of someone who knew how precious opportunity was. She liked science best, especially biology, and her handwriting small, tidy, slanted left-filled notebooks faster than any of her classmates. Meanwhile, Sonny had found his own rhythm. 3 days a week he joined Harper at the Midwest Center for Canine Therapy, now not just as her companion, but as a budding therapy dog. Ramona Caldwell, ever composed in her tailored vests and silk scarves, had assigned them to the senior companionship program, visiting assisted living homes and memory care centers. Their first assignment had been Willowbrook Residence, a red brick building with ivy climbing the walls and window boxes bursting with petunias. Sonny had padded through the entrance like he belonged there, tongue lolling, tail gently wagging. Inside, the residents, many in wheelchairs or with hands twisted by arthritis, lit up like candles at his approach. One woman in particular, Mrs. Bernice Clary, became Harper's favorite. Bernice was in her early 80s, slender as a crane with snow-white hair always pulled back into a bun. Her voice still held traces of her Tennessee roots, and though her memory flickered in and out, her sense of humor never dimmed. "Them eyes," she'd said the first time she saw Sonny. "He's got preacher eyes. Knows your heart before you speak." Harper laughed. "Yeah, he's good like that." Bernice would often ask Harper to sing for her. Something soft, she'd say. Something you ain't afraid to feel. And Harper did. Sometimes Amazing Grace, sometimes Bill Withers. And every time she sang, Sonny lay at her feet, still as a statue, his head resting on Bernice's slippered foot. Ramona watched it all with quiet satisfaction. One afternoon she pulled Harper aside. "You're doing real work," she said. "You're helping people heal just by being there." Harper looked down, modest. "Feels like I'm just being normal. That's the magic of it." Word spread. A local news reporter, Jasmine Soto, mid-30s Latina, always with a notebook tucked in her back pocket, came by to write a piece on the therapy center. She interviewed Harper and followed them to Willowbrook for a session. The article ran a week later with the headline, "From Streetlight to Spotlight, Teen and Her Dog Bring Healing to Chicago Seniors." The story went viral. Not the flashy, exploitative kind, but the quiet kind that made people stop scrolling and wipe their eyes. The center received donations calls and offers. One woman sent a hand-knitted dog vest with Sonny stitched across the back. Harper cried when she opened it. Then came the day Malcolm had been quietly working toward. One afternoon, Harper returned home from school to find Malcolm in the garage sanding a plank of wood. He wore his usual canvas apron and old ball-cap sawdust in his beard. She watched as he etched letters with a hand-carving tool carefully and deliberately. "What's it say?" she asked. He turned the wood so she could read Sonny's light center. Her breath caught. Malcolm cleared his throat. "I've been thinking. This place. It doesn't have to just be a house. It can be more. A place where people and dogs find their way again. What you and Sonny have. It should keep going. Help others." Harper ran her fingers across the carved words. "It's perfect." He looked at her, suddenly more serious. "And I've got one more thing to ask you." She glanced up. "I'd like to make it official," he said. "Adopt you. If you'll let me. I know I came late, but I want to stay." Her voice broke. "You sure you want a mouthy, stubborn used-to-be runaway?" He smiled. "Only if she still plays gospel in the evenings." She threw her arms around him. That evening, Harper and Malcolm mounted the wooden sign to the fence post at the front of the property. The sun dipped behind the house, casting the words in golden light. Sonny barked once, then sat proudly beneath the sign as if he understood its meaning. The evening air in Chicago was warm, touched with that rare kind of breeze that carried the promise of change. Inside the modest auditorium of the Community Learning Center, folding chairs lined every row, and the scent of carnations and printed paper programs floated in the air. On the far side of the room, sunlight poured in through tall windows, gilding the stage in a soft amber hue. Tonight was the spring graduation ceremony, and Harper Brooks, once just another forgotten face on a freezing street corner, was about to walk across the stage, head high, eyes clear, a melody burning in her heart. The audience was modest but full of warmth. Teachers, parents, caseworkers, and a few who had no obligation to be there except that they cared. In the front row sat Malcolm Hayes, dressed in his cleanest flannel shirt and slacks, his posture upright, but hands trembling slightly. In his lap rested a simple wooden picture frame, the photo inside aged but well kept. Cooper, his old partner tongue out and eyes bright, standing beside a younger Malcolm and Helen. Beside him, lying peacefully, was Sonny. He wore his therapy vest, but not the usual one. Tonight he had on a special sash, deep navy blue with golden embroidery that read, "Sonny's Light. Guardian and Guide." His muzzle had begun to lighten slightly with age, but his posture was proud ears alert, as if he knew this moment mattered. Backstage, Harper paced quietly, guitar in hand. Her fingers ran over the polished wood, the instrument a gift from one of the elderly residents at Willowbrook. Mrs. Clary now passed, but never forgotten. The guitar had been hers in the 1960s, painted with soft floral designs and names of favorite hymns. It had become Harper's treasured possession. Harper wore a simple cream dress and brown boots. Her hair was styled in a neat bun with a single braid hanging down her shoulder. A silver chain, a locket Malcolm had given her the day she received her GED diploma, glinted under the stage lights. When her name was announced, the room erupted in applause, not just polite, but heartfelt. She stepped into the spotlight and sat on the small stool at center stage. She adjusted the mic, cleared her throat, and took a breath that reached back through every cold night, every scar, every goodbye she hadn't had the chance to say. This song, she began, her voice steady, is for those who've walked in the dark so long they forgot the light was real. It's for those who stayed, and for those who led me home. She began to play. The song was called Where the Light Begins. It was a slow, melodic tribute, part folk, part gospel, part something entirely her own. Her voice rose and fell with the kind of emotion that couldn't be faked. There were verses about street corners and songs sung to no one, about golden eyes that never looked away, about firelight in an old man's kitchen and the sound of music behind closed doors. When she reached the final chorus, her voice faltered slightly, but it wasn't from nerves. It was the way her eyes locked on Malcolm in the front row, who had bowed his head, the photo frame of Cooper now held against his heart. And beside him, sunny eyes glistening, head tilted, tail thumping once, as if keeping rhythm. The final chord rang out and fell into silence. Then the room erupted again. Harper stood, gave a small nod, and smiled, genuine and quiet. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the room thinned to scattered laughter and embraces, Harper sat with Malcolm and Sonny near the front steps. She leaned her head against Malcolm's shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a while. He finally broke the silence. "You think Cooper heard it?" She smiled. "I think he never stopped listening." From that moment forward, the name Sonny's Light took on new life. Within the year, the property on the west side of town had been transformed. What was once a house and a backyard had become a haven. The front yard held a small painted sign, Therapy Dog Training, Music for Healing, Community Shelter. Children ran in the yard, some orphaned, some from foster systems, most with stories as fractured as Harper's once was. Inside, Harper taught group music therapy 3 times a week, guiding small hands over piano keys or teaching chords to teens who hadn't touched a guitar before. Her classroom echoed with laughter and hope. In the back lot, a second building had been raised with the help of local donations and volunteers. It held kennels, training rooms, and quiet spaces for rescues. Harper worked closely with Ramona, now semi-retired but still sharp and commanding, who often dropped by with tea and advice. Sonny remained Harper's shadow, older now, slower, but no less attuned. Even as he began to gray around the muzzle, he carried himself with dignity, his eyes still searching the room for those in need. And he always found them. Children who'd never had a family curled up with him during thunderstorms. Veterans sat silently with a hand on his back. Elderly clients at outreach events smiled wider when he walked in the door. And at night, when the house finally quieted, Harper would sit by the piano. Sometimes she played for herself, sometimes for Sonny. Always softly, always gratefully. She had once thought the world had no place for her. But now she had built one from broken pieces, from songs from fur and trust and time. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or lightning. They come quietly wrapped in kindness, carried on 4 legs, and placed gently into the life of someone who has forgotten what it means to be seen. Harper's story reminds us that no one is too broken to heal, and no heart is too lost to find home again. In the darkest corners of her life, it was not riches, fame, or power that saved her. It was love. The selfless love of a dog who refused to give up. The steadfast love of a man who chose to open his home. And above all, the quiet grace of a God who sees the invisible and turns forgotten lives into testimonies. When we reach out with compassion, when we offer warmth to someone shivering in their own silence, we become part of that divine plan. We become the light. So today, let Harper's journey be a reminder that miracles still happen, that second chances are real, that sometimes God sends angels in fur with wagging tails and eyes that say you are not alone, are not. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment and tell us how kindness changed your life. Subscribe for more stories where love overcomes darkness. And if you believe in the power of grace, type Amen in the comments below. May God bless all those who are searching for light. May He guide your steps, calm your storms, and place a sunny by your side when you need it most.